When the marriage shattered, the only sound left was the hum of the refrigerator, steady, indifferent, and cruelly alive. Years later, after betrayal, distance, and grief, that same sound filled a home reborn in forgiveness, echoing the quiet truth that life never waits for anyone to catch up. When I think back to the day everything fell apart, what strikes me most isn't the shouting or the slammed door, but the sound of the refrigerator humming in the silence afterward. That quiet, mechanical noise felt louder than anything else in the room. It filled the space where a family used to exist and somehow reminded me that even though my world had just ended, the rest of the house didn't care. The fridge still ran. The clock still ticked. Life carried on without asking if I wanted to follow. My wife, Claire, and I had been married for 12 years. We met when we were both working at the same small marketing firm downtown. She was the one who convinced me to leave my comfort zone. I was the quiet, analytical guy who ran numbers behind the scenes while she handled clients with that effortless charm she had since college. We balanced each other out, or at least that's what I believed for a long time. We built a simple life together in a quiet neighborhood where kids played in driveways and people waved as they mowed their lawns. We had 2 children, a son named Ethan and a daughter named Lily. They were my entire reason for existing. Everything I did revolved around them. I worked long hours, sure, but I never missed a game or a school play. I thought that meant something. What I didn't know then was that the person I trusted most was slowly unraveling everything we had built. The first clue was so small that I brushed it off completely. Claire started spending more time out with friends after work. She'd say they were catching up or networking. I didn't think twice about it. She had always been social, and I figured she needed her space just like I needed mine. But one night, when she came home later than usual, she smelled faintly of cologne that wasn't mine. It was our mutual friend Mark's. Mark and I had known each other since college. He was that confident, easygoing guy who always made people laugh. When Claire and I got together, he was one of the first people I introduced her to. The 3 of us spent countless weekends barbecuing in our backyard, talking about everything from work to vacations to the kids' school events. If you had told me then that he'd end up being the one to destroy my family, I would have laughed. But small things started to add up. Texts she'd hide, phone calls she'd take in another room, excuses that didn't quite line up. The pattern became impossible to ignore, and denial only lasts so long before it turns into self-betrayal. One evening, I left work early and drove home with a tight feeling in my chest that I couldn't explain. When I opened the door, the house was quiet. Too quiet for a Thursday when the kids were supposed to be home. I walked through the hallway, past the family photos, past the smell of dinner that hadn't been cooked. And then I saw her. Claire was sitting at the dining table, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, looking like she'd already rehearsed what she was about to say. She didn't look surprised to see me home early. Before I could ask, she said it. "I've been seeing someone else." She said it with the kind of calm that only comes from guilt that's already been accepted. I didn't yell. I didn't even ask who. I just sat down across from her and stared at the pattern on the mug she was holding. She must have thought I already knew, because when I asked if it was Mark, she didn't flinch. She just looked away and whispered, "I'm sorry." Sorry didn't change anything. Sorry didn't erase the image that burned into my head. The weeks that followed were a blur of lawyers, arguments, and boxes. She filed for divorce. She said she wanted full custody because I was too busy for the kids. As if working overtime to pay for the house she still wanted somehow made me a bad father. Her lawyer was ruthless. Mine was practical. And somewhere between the paperwork and the signatures, my children became names on a visitation schedule instead of voices calling me dad every night before bed. Claire got what she wanted: custody, the house, and the narrative. What I didn't expect was how fast she rewrote history. Within months, she had told Ethan and Lily that I'd left because of another woman. She told them I had abandoned them, that I didn't love them enough to stay. The part that hurt most wasn't that she lied. It was that they believed her. They were too young to know any better. And I didn't fight back at first. I thought time and patience would fix things. I thought they'd grow up and see the truth for themselves. But time doesn't fix a story that's been told too many times. Years went by. Birthdays missed. Letters returned. Messages unanswered. My own kids treated me like a ghost. And I kept quiet because I didn't want to turn them against their mother. I thought protecting them from the ugly truth was the right thing to do. Then one day, out of nowhere, Ethan called. He was 16 by then. His voice was deeper, steadier, almost unfamiliar. He said he wanted to meet for coffee. When we sat down across from each other, I noticed the way he kept studying me, like he was trying to reconcile the man in front of him with the one he'd been told about all his life. And then he asked, "Dad, why did you really leave?" For the first time in 10 years, I decided to tell the truth. That's when everything changed again. When Ethan asked that question, it felt like the air in the small cafe thickened until every breath came heavy. He wasn't accusing me, not exactly, but there was a weight behind his words that carried years of hurt I hadn't been allowed to touch. He looked older than 16 in that moment. His eyes were cautious but not hostile, the way someone looks when they want to believe you but aren't sure if they should. I didn't answer right away. I watched the way his hand moved around his coffee cup, restless, tracing the rim the way Claire used to do when she was anxious. For a second, I saw both of them in that movement and had to swallow the ache in my throat before it turned into something visible. I told him I left because I had no choice. It wasn't the answer he expected, and I could see the confusion on his face. So I went back to the beginning, the real beginning, the slow collapse that had started years before he was old enough to notice. I explained how I'd found out about Claire and Mark, how I tried to hold things together for the kids' sake, how I had begged her to go to counseling. She'd refused, said she needed freedom. A word that at the time felt like it had sharp edges. I didn't tell Ethan everything, not the details of what I saw or how deep the betrayal cut, but I told him enough that the truth had a shape he could recognize. He didn't interrupt. He didn't even move. He just listened, his face still and serious. I told him how his mother had taken the house in custody, how I had spent every weekend fighting for visitation, only to have Claire find new reasons to cancel. I told him about the birthday gifts I sent that were never acknowledged, about the nights I sat in an empty apartment staring at photographs wondering if they'd ever remember what my voice sounded like. When I finished, Ethan sat back and exhaled like he'd been holding his breath the entire time. He looked out the window for a while before speaking again. He said that Mom had told them I'd left for another woman, that I'd abandoned them because I didn't want to be a father anymore. He said Lily used to cry about it at night when she was little, asking what she did wrong. Hearing that nearly broke me. I didn't blame them for believing her. She was their daily world while I had become a stranger. Children don't question the person who tucks them in at night. They believe what they hear until something cracks the surface. I asked him why he was asking now after all this time. He said it was because of something he'd seen. Apparently, he'd found old photos on an old laptop. Pictures of me and the kids at the zoo, the lake, Christmas mornings before the split. He said there was one of me holding him on my shoulders, both of us covered in paint from when we tried to build a birdhouse. He said I looked happy. He said I looked like a man who didn't walk away from his family. That photo had survived everything I'd lost. After that conversation, Ethan didn't say much. He said he needed time to think. We finished our coffee mostly in silence. But before leaving, he asked if I still lived in the same place. When I nodded, he said maybe he'd come by sometime. That maybe was enough to keep me breathing for the first time in years. The next few weeks were strange. I didn't want to hope too much, but I found myself checking my phone constantly, waiting for a message that didn't come. Then one Sunday afternoon, there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, Ethan was standing there, hands in his pockets, looking awkward and unsure. He said he wanted to see where I lived. I let him in, and for the first time since the divorce, I had one of my kids sitting at my kitchen table again. The place was small, quiet, nothing fancy, but it was mine. He looked around, probably realizing how modest it was compared to the house he grew up in. He asked about a framed photo on the wall, one of him and Lily at the park when they were toddlers. I told him I'd taken it on a day Claire had to work, just the three of us chasing ducks by the pond. He smiled a little at that, and it felt like sunlight breaking through clouds that had been there for years. Over time, Ethan started visiting more often. First, it was just for an hour or two on weekends. We'd talk about school, his plans, his part-time job at the hardware store. He'd ask careful questions about the past. as if testing the edges of a story he'd been told for too long. I didn't push. I just let him come to his own conclusions. Then one evening he mentioned that he'd told Lily about our talk. He said she didn't believe him at first. She said I was just trying to make their mom look bad. But he'd shown her the old photos and something shifted. She wanted to talk to me too. That night after Ethan left, I sat alone on the couch and let myself cry for the first time in a long time. It wasn't out of sadness but something closer to relief. The kind that comes when a long storm finally shows signs of clearing. But what I didn't know then was that the storm wasn't done. Because once Claire found out that Ethan and Lily had started talking to me again, she called. And that phone call reopened every wound I thought had healed. When Claire's name flashed across my phone, I stared at the screen for a long while before answering. I hadn't heard her voice in nearly 3 years, and I could already imagine the tone she'd use before she even spoke. That deliberate calm she always adopted when she wanted to sound reasonable while twisting the knife at the same time. I almost didn't pick up, but curiosity mixed with a kind of weary resignation, and I found myself saying hello before my better judgment caught up. Her voice was exactly as I remembered it. Smooth, deliberate, every syllable measured like she'd rehearsed it. She said she'd heard from Ethan that he'd been visiting me. She didn't even phrase it as spending time with his father. It was visiting, like checking in on a distant relative or a former acquaintance. She asked why I thought it was appropriate to fill his head with false stories. The accusation in her tone was soft but sharp enough to draw blood. I kept my voice steady. I told her I hadn't filled anyone's head with anything. I just answered the questions her lies had created. That silence on the other end was brief, but I could hear her breathing change, that familiar hitch that meant she was furious but trying not to show it. She said I was being selfish, that I was ruining the stability she'd worked so hard to give the kids, that they didn't need my version of the past confusing them. I almost laughed. My version. As if the truth was just another narrative option she could choose to reject. When she realized I wasn't arguing, she changed tactics. She reminded me how hard she'd worked to raise them on her own, how she had done everything to make sure they had a good life after I walked out. I reminded her that she was the one who rewrote that part of the story. There was a pause, and then she said, with that careful edge in her voice, that the past didn't matter anymore. What mattered now was keeping things peaceful. Peaceful, in Claire's dictionary, always meant obedient. I didn't answer her right away. I think she expected me to fold the way I used to during arguments when we were married, to let her set the terms just so we could move on. But those days were gone. So I told her that if she wanted peace, the best way to have it was to stop interfering with Ethan and Lily's decisions. I said they deserved to know me on their own terms. The line went quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "If you hurt them again, I'll never forgive you." I almost told her that she'd already used that phrase years ago when she stood in our driveway holding the custody papers. But I didn't bother. There was no point fighting ghosts of old arguments. I just told her goodbye and hung up. That night, I sat by the window for a long time, thinking about how anger and love often feel the same when they're tangled up in history. Part of me still remembered the woman I married, the one who used to hum while folding laundry or laugh at the wrong moments in movies. Another part of me remembered the betrayal so vividly that my hands still clenched at the thought. It's strange how those two versions of someone can live inside you at once. Ethan came by a few days later, and I didn't tell him about the phone call. I didn't want to drag him into another battle. Instead, we just ordered pizza and watched a movie. For the first time, he looked comfortable in my home. His laughter came easier. It reminded me of the little boy who used to run through the sprinkler in the backyard, soaked and fearless. A week later, Lily called. Her voice was hesitant, small, as if she was afraid I wouldn't want to hear it. She said Ethan had told her everything, and she wanted to ask if it was all true. I told her yes. She didn't speak for a while after that. I could hear her breathing, steady but trembling at the edges. Then she said something that stayed with me for days. She said she didn't know who to be angry at anymore. I told her she didn't have to be angry at anyone. I said sometimes grown-ups make mistakes they can't fix, and kids get caught in the middle. She said that wasn't fair. And she was right. We talked for nearly an hour. She asked if I ever stopped thinking about them, and I told her never, not for a single day. She asked why I didn't fight harder, and I told her I did, but the system doesn't care much about quiet fathers. She went quiet again and then said she wanted to see me. That meeting was even harder than the one with Ethan. She looked so much like her mother at that age that for a second, it felt like time had folded in on itself. But the difference was in her eyes. They had a depth of hurt that Claire never carried. She asked if I hated their mother. I said no. Hatred is still a kind of attachment, and I was done being attached to pain. Over the next few months, both kids began spending more time with me. It wasn't official visitation, just hours here and there, but it was enough to rebuild something that had been broken for so long. We cooked dinner together, took walks, watched old family videos. Every time I saw them laugh, a small part of the weight I'd carried for years lifted. Then, one evening, Ethan showed me a message on his phone from Mark. Yes, that Mark. The man who had once been my closest friend. He had messaged Ethan on social media, asking to meet, saying he wanted to clear the air. That name I hadn't spoken in nearly a decade suddenly came back like a sour taste. I told Ethan not to respond yet. He asked why. I said some truths don't need revisiting, but I could see curiosity burning behind his eyes. He wanted answers, not from me this time, but from the man who had destroyed his family. I realized then that the past wasn't done with us after all. When Ethan told me he wanted to meet Mark, I felt a cold tightness crawl up my chest, the kind that squeezes rather than aches. I hadn't seen or heard from that man in nearly 10 years, and the idea of my son sitting across from him made my stomach turn. Ethan said he just wanted to ask a few questions to understand what really happened between his mother and me. I told him that sometimes understanding doesn't make the pain any smaller, but he said he needed to see things for himself. There was a calm certainty in his voice that reminded me of my own father, and I realized this was a decision I couldn't take away from him. I told him I wouldn't stop him, but I asked one thing. Whatever Mark said, he should come to me afterward before drawing any conclusions. He nodded, though his eyes were still distant in that way people look when they're already somewhere else in their minds. The meeting happened a few days later at a small diner halfway between our neighborhoods. I didn't go, of course, but waiting for Ethan's message that night was its own kind of torture. The hours stretched into something endless until finally around 10, he texted me asking if he could come over. When I opened the door, he looked like he'd aged a few years in one evening. He sat down at the kitchen table without saying anything for a long while, just staring at his hands. Then he told me everything. Mark hadn't denied the affair. He said it started long before the divorce, when Claire had confided in him about how lonely she felt, how distant I supposedly was. He painted himself as a man who had simply fallen in love with a woman who wasn't being loved properly. Ethan said Mark had even tried to justify it by saying love doesn't follow rules. I could tell Ethan was trying to process two versions of the same story colliding in his head. He asked if I really had been distant like Mark said. I told him the truth, that maybe I wasn't perfect, but I had been faithful, loyal, and blind to what was happening right in front of me. I told him there's a difference between imperfection and betrayal. He asked if I had ever confronted Mark back then. I said no, not really. By the time I learned the full truth, they were already living together and Claire had the court's decision in her favor. I said I thought staying angry would only poison what little chance I had left to be in their lives. So I walked away quietly. Ethan didn't say much after that. He looked lost, the way people do when they realize their memories might not match the reality behind them. I told him that sometimes forgiveness isn't about excusing someone, it's about freeing yourself from being tied to them. He nodded, but I could see he wasn't ready to hear that yet. Over the next few weeks, things shifted again. Ethan started spending even more time at my place, sometimes bringing Lily along. We'd cook dinner together and laugh about old memories that had somehow survived Claire's version of events. But under that warmth, there was a tension I couldn't quite place. I noticed the way Ethan grew quieter every time his phone buzzed. I figured it was Claire checking in, but he never said much about it. Then one evening, while we were cleaning up after dinner, he told me something that stopped me cold. He said Mark and his mother weren't together anymore. Apparently their relationship had ended years ago, but she had kept that detail from the kids to avoid questions. She told them he had moved overseas for work, which now I realized was another carefully built story. Ethan said she'd grown bitter over the years, though he couldn't understand why. That revelation stirred something I hadn't felt in years, not satisfaction exactly, but a strange sadness mixed with closure. The woman who had once torn my life apart was now living inside her own consequences. But before I could say anything, Ethan told me there was more. Mark had told him that Claire blamed me for everything even after all this time. She told him I had ruined her reputation during the divorce and made her look like the villain. Hearing that almost made me laugh out loud because I had done the opposite. I had spent years staying silent just to protect the kids from that bitterness. A week later, Claire called again. This time her tone wasn't sharp, it was weary. She said she knew the kids had been spending more time with me and that maybe it was time to let things go. I could tell from the sound of her voice that she wasn't calling to make peace, she was calling because her control was slipping. She said something that stayed with me though. She said she never meant to hurt anyone, that she just wanted to feel loved again. I didn't respond right away. I thought about all the years of silence, the birthdays missed, the lies told to two innocent kids. Then I told her that love built on deception doesn't last and that the truth had finally caught up to both of us. She didn't argue. She just sighed and said maybe she deserved that. When the call ended, I sat there for a long while staring out the window at the streetlights flickering against the dark. For the first time in years, the anger wasn't there. What replaced it was something quieter, something closer to understanding that people destroy themselves long before they destroy others. The next day, Ethan told me Lily wanted to stay with me for the summer. He said she was tired of walking on eggshells at home, tired of pretending everything was fine. I told him of course she could. That night when I lay in bed, I realized something I hadn't dared to think before. Maybe the past had finally loosened its grip. But the peace I'd started to feel came with an unexpected complication, because the more time I spent with my kids, the more I noticed how much damage the years of distance had done to them in ways they couldn't even see. And fixing that would be harder than forgiving their mother. That summer started quietly. The air in my house changed the moment Lily moved in, bringing a new kind of noise that I hadn't realized I missed until I heard it again. The faint sound of her playing music in her room while doing homework, the soft thud of her footsteps as she walked down the hallway late at night to grab a glass of water, the hum of life that had been missing for so many years. I had grown used to the stillness of this place, but now it felt alive again. Ethan was over nearly every weekend, and sometimes after work he'd stop by unannounced just to talk. The three of us would sit on the porch eating takeout while the sky shifted from gold to gray. They'd tell me small stories about school, about friends, about the little things I never got to hear during the years when I was the villain in their minds. I tried not to push too hard, tried not to act like I was making up for lost time, because you can't really make up for a decade. You can only start where you are and hope it's enough. Still, I noticed pieces of their mother in their habits. Lily was cautious with her words, often apologizing before saying something that might sound critical. Ethan carried a quiet defensiveness, like he was always ready for someone to accuse him of something. It broke me to realize how much emotional weight they had learned to carry from watching adults fail at love. One afternoon while Lily was at a friend's house, Ethan and I went fishing at a small lake outside town. We didn't catch much, but that wasn't the point. He told me more about what life had been like growing up with Claire after the divorce. He said she'd always seemed angry underneath everything, even when she was being affectionate. He said she'd make comments about me, sometimes subtle ones that didn't sound like insults but always left a bitter taste. Things like, "Your dad never understood what family really means," or, "Some people just can't handle responsibility." Hearing it didn't surprise me, but what struck me most was how calmly Ethan told me. There was no resentment in his voice, just quiet reflection. He said he used to believe her because she sounded so sure. Then when he got older and saw how she talked about other people, the pattern started to click. He realized she didn't just rewrite my story, she rewrote everyone's to fit the way she wanted to see the world. That night Lily came home with a box of old photos she'd found in Claire's attic. She said she'd wanted to bring them over because they felt more like they belonged here. Inside were pictures from vacations, birthdays, even lazy Sunday mornings I had forgotten about. There was one of Claire and me sitting on the floor with the kids building a fort out of blankets and couch cushions. In the picture she's smiling at me, the kind of smile that once made me believe everything was unbreakable. I stared at it for a long time before sliding it back into the box. Lily asked what I was thinking about. I told her I was remembering what good days used to look like and that sometimes the good memories are harder to face than the bad ones. She nodded and said she felt the same way. We started a small ritual after that. Every few nights we'd pull out one photo from the box and talk about it. Not just what happened that day, but what we remembered feeling. It became a quiet kind of healing for all of us. Some nights we laughed about how badly I'd burned dinner or how Ethan had once convinced Lily that squirrels could talk. Other nights we just sat in silence, staring at the faces frozen in happier times. Around the middle of July, Claire called again. Her tone this time was different, soft, tired, almost human. She asked if Lily was okay, if she was eating well, if she'd been spending time outside. I told her yes and asked if she was doing all right herself. She hesitated, then said she didn't know. She mentioned that Mark had recently reached out to her again, and it had stirred up old regrets. I didn't ask for details. Some doors stay better closed. After that conversation, I started noticing a change in Lily. She grew quieter, especially after phone calls with her mother. One evening, while we were watching a movie, she asked if people could change. I told her that depends on what they do with their guilt. She nodded slowly and didn't say anything else for the rest of the night. A few days later, Ethan told me he thought Claire might want to see me. I asked him what made him think that, and he said she'd mentioned wanting to make things right before it's too late. The way he said it made me wonder if she was sick or just lonely. Either way, the idea of seeing her again after everything that happened filled me with a strange unease that I couldn't quite name. That night I went for a long walk through the neighborhood. The houses were quiet and the smell of summer rain hung in the air. I realized I wasn't angry anymore, not even afraid, just tired of the weight of old ghosts. Maybe seeing her wouldn't fix anything, but maybe it could close the final chapter of a story that had gone on too long. So I told Ethan that, if she really wanted to talk, she could call me one last time. I didn't know then how much that decision would stir up the past all over again. Because when Claire finally did call, she didn't ask to apologize. She asked for something much heavier. When Claire finally called, she waited until almost midnight to do it, which told me everything before she even spoke. Late-night phone calls always mean something heavy. Her voice was quiet when I answered, softer than I remembered, but still careful in the way she always spoke when she wanted something. She said she didn't know how to start the conversation, and I told her to just start wherever she could. For a moment I could hear her breathing, uneven, almost shaky, and that small sound made me realize how long it had been since I'd heard her without the armor in her voice. She said she had been to the doctor for a checkup after ignoring a few symptoms for months, and they'd found something serious. I didn't ask what right away because I already knew by the way she said it that it wasn't minor. Then she told me she had breast cancer and it had already spread. I sat there on the edge of my bed, the light from the street lamp stretching through the blinds across the floor, while I tried to find words that didn't exist. She said she didn't want sympathy. What she wanted was help. At first I thought she meant emotional help, someone to talk to, but she meant something else entirely. She said she was terrified of leaving the kids alone, especially Lily. She said Ethan was almost grown now, but Lily still needed guidance. Then she asked me if I could promise that when her time came I would take care of them. For a moment all I could do was breathe. The silence that followed was long enough that she started to cry softly, the kind of crying people do when they're trying not to be heard. I told her of course I would take care of them, that I never stopped wanting to. I meant it too. Whatever she had done, no illness should erase her humanity, and no anger should erase my responsibility. We talked for almost an hour that night, and it was the strangest conversation I've ever had. She told me how she tried to move on after the divorce, how things with Mark had fallen apart within 2 years, how she'd dated other people but never really found peace. She said she used to tell herself that she'd made the right choices, but lately she wasn't sure what that even meant anymore. I didn't respond much. It felt less like she wanted forgiveness and more like she just needed someone to hear her truth before time ran out. After we hung up, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen staring at the dark window, thinking about how strange life can be. The person who once destroyed me was now the one asking me to protect what was left of her world. The next morning I told Ethan and Lily. They both went still, the way people do when they're trying not to show how scared they are. Ethan nodded quietly, said he had suspected something because she'd been acting different lately. Lily broke down and I pulled her into my arms for the first time since she was little. She sobbed into my shoulder, asking why bad things keep happening to people who try to do better. I didn't have an answer for that. Over the next few weeks, everything shifted again. Claire started treatment and the kids spent their time bouncing between her house and mine. The walls between all of us began to soften in strange ways. One afternoon when I dropped Lily off for a doctor appointment, Claire asked me to come inside for a moment. Her hair had started to thin and she looked smaller somehow, but her eyes were calm. She thanked me for being kind to her despite everything. I told her kindness isn't about forgetting the past, it's about not letting it control the present. For the first time she smiled without guilt in it. She said she wished we'd learned that lesson earlier. As the months passed, her health declined faster than anyone expected. The kids started spending most of their time with me. I watched Ethan take on the role of caretaker with a quiet maturity that broke my heart and made me proud at the same time. Lily struggled more, but she found comfort in painting, and sometimes I'd find her in the kitchen with her art supplies spread across the table sketching old family photos from the box she'd brought. In late autumn, Claire called one last time. She said she didn't want to die angry or afraid. She asked if I could visit her the next day. When I walked into her room the next afternoon, she was sitting by the window looking out at the garden. The room smelled like lavender and medicine. She looked up and smiled a small tired smile. She said she had spent years blaming me because it was easier than blaming herself. She said she'd told herself so many stories about what happened that, after a while, she couldn't tell which ones were true anymore. Then she said something that I don't think I'll ever forget. She said maybe forgiveness isn't something we give to others, but something we finally give to ourselves when we stop pretending we're right. I sat with her for a long time. We didn't talk much after that. Sometimes the truest peace comes from silence. She passed away 2 weeks later. After the funeral, the kids came home with me permanently. The house felt heavy for a while, filled with all the echoes of what had been lost, but also with something else. A quiet steadiness that felt almost sacred. That night, when the house finally went still, I stood by the window and thought about everything that had led us here. How love and betrayal and time had all twisted together into something I never could have predicted. How sometimes the person who breaks your heart ends up being the one who teaches you how to keep it open. I thought the story had finally reached its end, but I was wrong, because just as life began to settle again, an envelope arrived in the mail addressed to me in Claire's handwriting, dated 2 days before she died. The envelope sat on the kitchen table for nearly 2 hours before I found the nerve to open it. There was something about seeing her handwriting again that made my hands unsteady. She always wrote with that slow, careful script that curved slightly to the right, the same way she used to lean when she laughed. I could have left it sealed forever, and part of me wanted to, but another part of me knew that if she had taken the time to write one last letter, it deserved to be read. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded neatly in thirds. There were no long paragraphs, no drawn-out explanations, just a handful of lines written with the same quiet precision she had always carried. She wrote that she had been thinking about how memory changes shape over time and how two people can live the same story yet remember it as 2 different lives. She wrote that she didn't expect forgiveness, but she hoped I would remember the good parts too, because they were real even if the ending was not. She said that she wished she had learned earlier that love is not about possession or winning or proving a point, but about letting people be who they are and loving them anyway. Then near the end she said something that stopped me cold. She wrote that the kids would need me not because she was gone, but because she had taught them how to protect themselves so much that they might forget how to trust. She said that I should be patient with them when they pull away and gentle when they test the boundaries of my love, because the world will never be as soft with them as it was supposed to be. At the bottom of the page, she had written 3 words that were both simple and impossible. Thank you anyway. I sat there for a long time after finishing the letter. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, the same sound that had filled the silence the night our marriage fell apart. But now that sound didn't feel empty anymore. It felt steady, like a reminder that even after everything that breaks, life continues to move forward. I folded the letter back up and placed it in the box of old photographs. It felt right to keep all of it together, the memories, the pain, the pieces of a life that had both built me and undone me. Later that evening, I called Ethan and Lily into the living room and told them about the letter. I didn't read it aloud, but I told them what it said about trust and patience. They listened quietly, and when I was done, Lily reached out and took my hand. The next few months moved gently. We settled into a rhythm that didn't need constant words. I started cooking dinner most nights while Ethan worked part-time and Lily prepared for her college applications. There were still moments when the grief came in waves, especially for them, but the difference now was that we faced it together instead of alone. One evening in early spring, we went through the old photo box again. We stopped at a picture of the four of us at the lake on a windy day years ago. Claire was sitting on the blanket with her hair whipping across her face, laughing while the kids were splashing in the water. For the first time in years, I didn't feel that sharp ache of loss when I looked at her. What I felt instead was gratitude that, for a while, at least we had been happy. Later that night, after the kids went to bed, I sat on the porch watching the streetlights flicker against the dark. I thought about everything that had happened, how betrayal had turned into distance, how distance had turned into silence, and how silence had finally turned into understanding. I realized that forgiveness had never been about condoning what she did, but about freeing myself from reliving it every day. In a strange way, Claire's illness had given us all a second chance, not to rewrite the story but to stop letting the old version define us. Ethan had grown into a quiet, patient man, and Lily had started painting scenes of light breaking through clouds, as if she finally believed in better days again. Watching them find their way back to themselves was more healing than anything I could have imagined. Now sometimes when I wake up before sunrise and the house is still, I walk down the hallway and listen to the faint rhythm of their breathing in their rooms. It reminds me that even when love fails, duty remains, and sometimes duty grows into something even stronger than love. I still visit Claire's grave once in a while, not out of guilt, but because it feels like visiting an old chapter of myself that I finally understand. I tell her about the kids, about how they're doing, about how life has somehow found a way to keep going. I tell her that the garden she used to tend still blooms every spring because Lily made sure to plant new seeds. And when I walk back to the car afterward, I always feel the same calm thought settle in my mind. We can't rewrite the past, but we can learn how to live beside it without letting it swallow us. I guess in the end, that's what forgiveness really is. Not forgetting what happened, but remembering without needing it to hurt anymore. That's how I know I've finally found peace.